My name is Jeanne Shannon, and my publishing history goes back into the mists of history. To about 1962, I had my first poem in print. And I've been publishing poetry and some fiction and memoir essays and so forth from that day on to this.
I'm going to stand up so you all have a face to look at from the back of the room there. I do solely nonfiction, and I've written about somewhere around 250 magazine articles, and I have 8 nonfiction books in print now. So that's my background.
I'm Jim Tritten. I've been publishing, getting printed since high school when I was at the forefront of fake news. We had a column called Harvey's Corner, and we literally just made it up.
If you move from under that speaker, there won't be feedback.
And there's no feedback here.
Sam's adjusting in the closet too.
Anyway, I've published lots of stuff and won lots of awards for my publications.
All right, Joe, and I'm part of this panel too, as well as moderating it. I started getting published at first in the mid-'70s when my poems were appearing alongside Jeanne Shannon's poems in the Margarine Maypole Orangutan Express, which was published by Carl Mayfield, and it came out I think every month, didn't it, Jeanne? Something like that.
Yes.
So I had a lot of poems in that monthly Albuquerque publication. And probably a year or so before I actually met Jeanne Shannon, I became very familiar with her name. So what we're going to do now is each of our panelists is going to talk about what was required to get published when they started. And then each panelist is going to talk a little bit about how things have changed, because what you need to do to get published when we started is different from what you need to get published today. Real quick, my background is I started studying out fiction and poetry in the early 70s, decided, heck, maybe I need a degree to do this, and so I went to UNM and took every creative writing class they had and wrote for the UNM Lobo. Then I had to make a big decision at the end of the 70s is, did I want to take that information and become a teacher? Did I want to take that information and become a writer? Becoming a writer basically meant becoming a journalist if I wanted to make a living at writing, since I didn't see any want ads for poets and fiction writers. And so that's what I did. I've made my living as a journalist since the early 80s, but I continue to write poetry and fiction. So here's Jeanne Shannon with a little bit about what it took to get published when she started out.
As I said, I started out in the early 60s, long before the internet, long before computers were on everybody's desk. And the way you found out about where you might send your poems out for publication was through print sources or by word of mouth, or both. And back in those days, there was a publication published annually, I believe, called the International Directory of Little Magazines and Small Presses, published by Dust Books in California. And it kept growing every year. It kept getting bigger and bigger. There were more markets to consider. And I bought that book every year, and I studied it very closely, and I would send away for sample copies of magazines to see what kind of poetry they were interested in, what kind of poetry did what I write fit what they wanted. And in some cases, I discovered that what they published was utter dreck, and I didn't want to be in that publication. So that's one of the things you could find out by sending for a sample copy. And there were other magazines and publications. There were directories of poetry publishers, and there were a lot of magazines that had a section in the back about markets, and that's where I found some of the places where I could send poems. And I say poems because that's all I was writing in those days. But as it went on into the 70s, I was writing fiction as well. A lot of people are still amazed to know that I've ever written anything called fiction, but I have. And a lot of the fiction that I wrote was short stories, and they were all really kind of derived from my childhood in Loretta Lynn's country, Appalachia, coal mining country. In my case, it was on the Virginia side of the line rather than Loretta Lynn's Kentucky side. But there was a limited market for that sort of thing outside Appalachia itself. So I tracked down a lot of magazines in that part of the country, and one of my first, I consider it an important publication, was a story I had in Appalachian Heritage magazine in 1974, and I had published other fiction in that part of the world, and I kept on publishing poetry in little magazines, including the Marjoram Maypole Orangutan Express, which was very local, and Carl Mayfield stopped publishing that several years ago, but it was a treasure while it lasted. So shall I go on to the present?
Why don't we come back to the present?
Okay.
Back to the present, I like that.
Yeah, we'll come back to the present.
Come back to the present, okay. I decided about 30 years ago that I wanted to develop a career as a writer. And I didn't have any background in that at all. So I took a continuing ed class at UNM from Eileen Stanton, and I know some of you here remember her. And she had a wealth of information about how to get published in magazines, and we wrote some sample articles, and I got very positive feedback for what I wrote. So I thought, okay, I'm going to do this. And I subscribed to Writer's Digest and The Writer, and I joined SouthWest Writers and started looking for places to get published. And I didn't really know what kind of articles I wanted to write. I just wanted to write them. And so I started out by sending articles of things that were of interest to me. One of the first queries that I sent out that actually ended up getting accepted was to a parenting magazine, because I was finishing a career as a stay-at-home mom and wanting to move into a different profession. So I wrote a parenting article. And I've always been interested in technology. I have a degree in mathematics. I'm married to a civil engineer. So I like tech sorts of things. And so I was looking at starting a business. I was subscribing to a business called Home Office Computing, that was it. And this was when cell phones were just starting out. You remember they had bag phones. You could carry around the battery with the phone attached. And they had brick-sized cell phones. And I thought, oh, cell phones are so cool. I want one. But they cost about $1,000, and I couldn't afford one. So I pitched Home Office Computing magazine about taking their readers with me as I shopped for a cell phone. And I got the article. Those were the first 2 articles I had published. And then I started writing for Albuquerque Monthly was that the magazine at the time. Yeah, Rick Homans was the publisher, and I got started with that. And then he also had a publishing company that he did other publications for. So I wrote PR pieces for TechNet and even the Navajo Nation Economic Development Guide. So I was getting experience in a broad range of topics. I wrote travel articles, I wrote personality profiles, just about everything. And then I saw an ad in a civil engineering type magazine that what was then known as Gale Research was looking for writers to contribute chapters to a book called When Technology Fails. And these would be case studies of structural collapses. And so I pitched them. Oh, and by that time I had written a few articles for SouthWest Contractor magazine because my husband knew the guy who published it, and so I tried them and I got some articles published. And then I got I wrote, I think, 3 chapters for that book. And then I decided to kind of specialize in the construction and engineering trade, and so I started going to trade shows and talking with representatives from those kinds of trade magazines that had booths at these trade shows, and I got some gigs from doing that. And then eventually I got a call from an editor at another branch of Gale Research that was asked me to do a book for middle school and high school students about multiculturalism. And it was, in fact, called, I ended up doing 2 of them, Arab American Biography and Arab American Voices. And this was in 2000. So it was just before 9/11, and it gave information about people who immigrated from Arab countries into America. And that's when I learned I could write a book. And it had seemed intimidating to me at first, but then I convinced myself that writing a book is just writing a series of articles called chapters. And so I was willing to take that on, and the fact that I was going to get paid for learning how to write a book helped as well. And so then I've been doing magazine articles, websites, and books ever since.
Too many moving parts is another thing. To stand up here, I know there's no feedback. At least I hope there's no feedback, right? Okay, so I'm Jim. Let me talk to you about how did I get started publishing and how can you do the same thing. So what are some easy starts? Well, one, you could become the secretary of SouthWest Writers. You get to write every month. And people critique it. Where is DK? Yeah, there's my editor. I never get a set of minutes out without having it fixed. That's good. Other things. You all have opinions. I know there's lots of people in here with opinions. Write a letter to the editor. It could be the Corrales comment, where we have certainly got lots of very interesting issues that people have very strong opinions on. But I've also had my letters published in the LA Times and Newsweek magazine. Write a book review. You got lots of books that you all read, and you can write a quick book review on Amazon.com or on Goodreads. That's being published, and then you can send it off to the print places later if you want. You really got strong opinions, write an op-ed piece. Tell somebody what you think about an issue and develop enough depth to it that they'll actually want to publish it. Second place I turned, second major area that I turned was when I went to school, after high school and doing fake news for the Gorton newspaper. Gorton, I don't even know the name of it. But we all wrote papers when you went to school. And some of you are still going to school and you're still writing papers. And I started realizing, okay, if the professor is going to critique it and all of the other students are going to critique my paper, well then I've got actually a pretty good paper when I'm all done. Maybe somebody will publish it. And they did. And so submit them to the kind of places that you would be reading when you were writing those stories. Next step up was contests. That was a very big, lucrative venue for me. I was able to enter lots of contests that paid lots of good money, to the point where I actually had to open up one of those SEP IRAs to handle the money and pay myself some dividends on that. So contests, I made a lot of money out of contests over decades. And eventually then you start getting recognized as somebody who actually knows something and knows how to write, okay? So then you get invited to conferences, and you get invited to give a presentation, and the presentations may appear in a anthology at the end. Or if you're lucky enough, like I was, I wrote a dissertation, and somebody, a bunch of professors critiqued it, so I turned it into a book. So try to take as many things that you're going to do anyway and turn them into something that will get you published. Now, when I stopped working, I started doing other things, other motivations to write, like I write for therapy. I was a Navy pilot and I crashed an airplane. I have PTSD. I write for therapy. Not everybody sees all that stuff. I also write to keep my mind engaged. That's another thing that's important as we age, to try to keep the little gray cells going. Sometimes what I write to keep my mind engaged are funny, and I enjoy writing them. My wife doesn't always enjoy me picking on her as the butt of most of the jokes. Like just what are the difference between men and women buying shoes? Why do we need pink duct tape? There's lots of good stories like that. It's not often. It's hard to get those published though. And then I write as a member of a writing group. You've all heard us talk about the Corrales Writing Group. Well, we started experimenting a year ago, and we did collaborative writing. So everybody at that table over there, we've all written together, and we've had our stories published. And we've been extremely successful because we listened at a writing conference to what genre sells. And we listened to people talk about that in this forum. And the answer was romance. I've never written romance. I've never read romance. I am now a multiple published romance writer. And we've had a lot of fun doing that. And then finally, there's the last category is I write stories and I don't know why. And I just need to write. And what's been really interesting is that 2 or 3 of them have won first place in competitions. And something that I'm working on right now, I can't tell you why I'm writing it, but I know I am.
All right, thanks, Jim. My background when I first started getting published was to learn as much as I could about the market and learn as much as I could about writing. So I did both all the time. Back then, the most important periodicals for someone who was trying to get published were The Writer and Writer's Digest. And of course, the Bible during that era was Writer's Market, and that included all the markets, or a good deal of them. I found early on that I was going to have more success with magazines that weren't as well known as, rather than magazines that were very well known. I started out with children's writing, and so I sent to Highlights and the big writing magazines at the time until I found some of the smaller markets. The first fiction I ever got published was in a periodical that went out to Methodist Sunday school students. Doesn't sound like much, but the circulation was over 200,000. So there, I kept looking for these little hidden gems. I would go to the big magazine displays, whether it was Page One. There were a few other stores that were very rich with their magazines, and I would go there 2 or 3 times a month looking for new publications, because I discovered quickly that a new publication is going to be quicker to accept you than an established one. I got my first poem published in a magazine called Cedar Rock, which was a Texas magazine. It was named after the fact that the predominant landscape in the area where it was published was rock and cedar. I remember the editor who accepted that poem. Her name was Naomi Shehab. She later on married somebody named Nye, and so she's Naomi Shehab Nye. And I'm sure Jeanne probably knows that name. She's become a very prominent poet. That name was new to me then, and it's been kind of fun over the years to see that the person who first accepted a poem of mine has gone on to be very successful. So I was willing to write anything because I really wanted to be a writer. And I spent a lot of time paying attention to one of the premier freelance writers here in Albuquerque, and that was Lois Duncan. That was her pen name. Her real name was Lois Arquette. And she talked a lot and wrote a lot about writing about true experiences. And she tells the story of being a single mother with 3 kids and making her living selling to the confessions market. So I started selling to the confessions market. And of course I was terribly embarrassed about this. And I didn't tell anybody I knew that I was sending out stories to the confessions market. Now those are all the magazines like True Confessions, True Love, Modern Romance. There were about 12 of them at the time. They came out 12 times a year, and each one of them published 12 stories. That was 140 stories that were being bought each month by these publications. I thought, I got a shot at that. And I knew they were all written by freelancers. At the time, they paid about $300 or $400 per story, and that was like 1980. And at the time, you could almost live on $300 or $400 a week. And so my goal was to sell one of those a week. And it took a while. I had to get pretty humble. At first, I thought that my writing was better than these magazines. That is a bad attitude. I'm not trying to write for a magazine. And after a few rejections, I got properly humbled. I thought, I think I might have to read these magazines a little more closely. And I did. And I started just reading them voraciously, and I started thinking, these stories aren't bad. So I started improving my stories, and I started selling them. So while I had been embarrassed when I first started sending them out, once I started selling them, I started telling everybody, I'm writing for the confessions market. And the first talk I ever gave on writing was here in, I think it was in this room, SouthWest Writers, in the mid-'80s. I gave a talk on how to write for the confessions market. That's just a tiny example of what it takes. It takes a willingness to take the market seriously, to study the markets, to see whether there's something inside you that can really respond to this market. And there is a single woman in trouble hiding somewhere inside me. And I drew upon that voice and sold a lot of stories. So that humility was a big lesson for me, but also a willingness to really study the markets. That's how it was back in that day. Now we're going to move on to how has it changed. And so Jeanne's going to kick it off on how things are so much different today than they were when we all first started out.
Well, for one thing, there's the internet. And I'm not writing much poetry these days, but if the muse dictates a poem and I'm looking for a place to send it, I search online. There are a number of different ways to do it. See, I think Duotrope is the one that I subscribe to occasionally, and then I let my subscription expire, and it gives you a weekly list of markets for either poetry or fiction or both. And then Poets and Writers magazine publishes a list of poetry magazines. They pretty much keep it updated, and you can explore that. But really what has been happening lately is I don't want to be bothered thinking about all the places where I might be able to send poems and might get an acceptance. I'll just put them together in a collection and I will self-publish. And so that's what I did with Summoning. Came out in the latter part of 2015 and won the New Mexico Book Award for Poetry in 2016. And it was brought into the world by Stuart Warren's Mercury Heartlink Enterprise. And I have another, I have a book in the mail that it's fiction, and actually I have a poetry book in the mail as well. But the next thing that's going to appear, at least that's my plan now, is to have Mercury Heartlink publish my fiction book called The Sourwood Tree, which is, it's a short story that's too long for a short story. It's about 11,000 words, and it's too short for a novella. But with Stuart could probably insert some interesting graphics, and we could make it look like a real book when it comes out. And so that's kind of the path I'm taking. If I did have some poems published by Jules Poetry Playhouse fairly recently, so there are some local markets, and I try to keep on top of them, but I really don't write enough poetry now to really worry about finding a place to have it published. And to me, self-publishing has become the way to go. I'm 81 years old. I don't have time to wait around for 10 years for somebody to send me a rejection slip.
Yeah, Jeanne hit it right on the nail on the head there with the internet. It's so much easier now because you don't have to send a letter with maybe a check in it for a sample copy of a magazine and wait for it to show up at your house so you can study this publication that maybe isn't carried in one of your local outlets. Now, most magazines put some sample copies available on their website, so you just go and you look. Once I found out I could write books, I started devoting more time to writing books than I did to the magazine market. If I were trying to earn money these days, I would be writing more magazine articles because you don't get much when you write books. But magazine writing can be very lucrative, and I highly recommend Melody's class. When I was writing regularly for magazines, my business bank account was healthier than it is now. But what I have found a couple of things different than when I was first trying to write. Attending conferences is a big one. And if you, back in, let's see, the first book that was really my idea and that I had to pitch and find a publisher for was called Underground Buildings More Than Meets the Eye. And it was something that I just thought was interesting. So I wrote an architecture book. And I didn't have any background in architecture, but what the heck. I found a publisher, and after it came out, a fellow contacted me who had a website called exactingeditor.com. And part of what he did was, as he traveled around the country on different business trips, he would try to find local authors wherever he went and interview them and put the interview up on his website. And so he contacted me and wanted to talk to me about my Underground Buildings book. So I had a very nice interview. I think it's still up there online. And one of the questions he asked me was, are you going to stick with architecture, or specifically underground buildings, or are you going to try and be a generalist and write books about lots of different things? And I thought, well, I don't know. I never really thought about it. And I wasn't really sure. I liked the underground buildings topic, but I didn't know what else to do with it. And so I was feeling kind of stuck, and I just kept writing magazine articles because that was shorter and easier. And then eventually I decided, my imagination, my creativity just got hooked on the idea about writing a book about New Mexico's contributions to space exploration. And I thought, well, I guess I'm going to write books about different topics. So I wrote that one, but then I found my niche, and I've done 3 other space-related books since then. And I think that's really the way to go if you're going to be writing books. Find your niche and stick with it. It took me a while to find mine, and I had some good experience, learned a lot along the way. I earned some money along the way. But once you find your niche, then stick with it, and it's easier then to build a platform, to build a reputation, to get known. And so I go to space conferences now, and I give talks. Giving talks is a much better way to sell your books than just having a book signing. I'm going to be at Treasure House Books on Sunday, tomorrow. So I'm not knocking book signings, and I hope some of you will stop by. But I sell more books when I give a talk and get people interested in what they can learn from reading my books. So that's, and then I'm also, a lot of the writing that I'm doing now is sort of on a volunteer basis, but it's to build my platform, to get more exposure. So I had occasion last year to meet the official historian for the Space Medicine Association. And he's responsible for contributing a monthly column to their membership magazine about the history of space exploration. Gee, what a concept. So I've written one article for him for that, and I'll probably do another one. And I'm not getting paid for that, but I figure it's getting the word out that I write about these topics. I'm also writing book reviews, as Jim mentioned. This is great. I write book reviews for the National Space Society. Again, it's getting my name out there. And I still occasionally pick up a paid magazine gig now and then. I just had one, as you probably heard me bragging about, the Air and Space magazine 2 months ago.
Okay, so what's changed in writing and that's different now? Well, number one, I retired. I have time. Now, I actually got paid to write while I was working, and so that really isn't true. I do have more time, but I still, that's a big difference for most of us in this room. Secondly is, I don't really care whether I get paid to publish anymore. I mean, that at one point drove me to go for high-priced contests, but right now, I could care less. Third, and this has been said, but I'll say it differently, the internet, clearly. For me, the big thing is the research. I just can't believe what you can, I mean, you can find everything. And and then you can find places to ask questions. For example, the story that I'm involved with right now is set in July of 1937. And I've got my main character going to the capital of Greenland. Question, did they have women from Denmark in Greenland in 1937? Well, I found out the answer, and I was able to get that through contacts on the internet. I mean, you can get people to answer questions for you. It's just terrific. You can get photos. I developed an entire chapter based on one photograph that I just happened to find. And I just went, oh, I got to use that somehow. And I was able to do that. And then, obviously, opportunities to publish. The opportunities to publish are there. All of the romances that the Corrales Writing Group has published in the last year and a half, we have gotten every single opportunity from a Facebook page. And they're easy. Another change. This may sound silly, but it's related to research. People live longer. Now that means that I have opportunities to talk to people that shouldn't be around this right now. So for example, my story set in July of 1937 is involves pilots flying a biplane. That doesn't exist anymore. I don't think there's even one anywhere. But I tracked down a pilot who flew that plane. In fact, he flew it with my father. And I was able to get really good, detailed information that only a pilot would ask from a knowledgeable source. You know, like, what did you wear? What you wear? Were you wearing a flight suit, a winter flight suit, a snow suit? What? Because I know you didn't have a heater. And then 6, you can volunteer to be the secretary of SouthWest. And then get asked to write something like, I think it was either Rose or one of you guys asked me to write a story about Goodreads, and how can we as authors use that. So lots of opportunities that I didn't have before.
All right. And I'll be the fourth one to say that the internet changed everything for me. When I was freelancing in the 80s, I felt very restricted by the fact that I lived in New Mexico. And I loved it here. I didn't want to move to Los Angeles, Chicago, Philadelphia, San Francisco, New York, or Miami. I wanted to live here in New Mexico, which really limited a lot of my opportunities as a writer. In response to that, I started a magazine. I started Chili Pepper in 1987 and owned it until 1996 and sold it, and it's still being published. And I did that because I wanted to make my living in publishing. But after 10 years of that, I realized that I was hiring other people to do the fun work, and I was spending all my time with accountants, attorneys, and salespeople. So I sold it specifically to go back to writing. Well, the big difference is that when I went back to freelance writing in 1997, there was this thing called the internet. And I also came back to writing with some real-world experience. I had been a small business owner for 10 years, so I had something to write about, and all of a sudden now I had a national audience, and that changed everything. Today I make my living as a senior editor for Design News, and I write about industrial technology. The reason I write about industrial technology is because I have background in small business and home business. And here's the chain. I started writing about small business and home business. The internet's getting bigger. I started writing about internet business. The internet's getting bigger. The consumer part of the internet collapses in the dot-com crash, but industry is still very bullish on the internet. That part of the internet never crashed. So I had opportunity to write about B2B use of the internet. How was Ford using the internet industrially? How were petroleum companies doing it? How was Enron stealing money from people on the internet? And so I started writing about that because I knew something about home business. And to this day, it's just been kind of like Loretta described, that one opportunity leads to another opportunity. I think there's a couple skills that really help if you're interested in writing. One is persistence. The other one is curiosity. And curiosity has always been my best friend. Another thing I learned in this new world of internet writing is that as many opportunities, and that the number of opportunities for writers continues to expand. And then one thing I learned, both as a publisher and as a freelancer, is there aren't enough good writers. Good writers are in demand. Every magazine, every book publishing company has a big problem. They can't find enough good writers. If you get good at what you're doing, you don't even have to send queries anymore. You can just approach a magazine in the field in which you've been writing and say, hey, do you have any freelance opportunities? If you want me to write a query, I'll send a query. But I got a background in the writing that you're producing, and I'm available. And I found that after a few years of getting published, that message worked, that message connected with editors because they can't find enough good writers. In the world of book publishing, when people go out to lunch, the editor and agent go out to lunch, who pays for lunch? The agent should pay for lunch since the agent has something to sell. What I've generally seen is that the editor pays for lunch. Why does the editor pay for lunch? Because the agent has the goods. When I go out to lunch with my agent or editor, who pays for lunch? Not me. The agent does when I go out with an agent, the editor does when I go out with an editor, and that's because the most valuable commodity in the publishing industry is the writer. Hey. That means you have to get pretty good at it, but if you get good at it, I don't care what's going on in the publishing industry, the writer is still the most important person in the room. And I'll tell you, agents and editors will make you feel the opposite. But it's true. When you talk to any agent or editor, what's your biggest problem? Not enough good writers. That does mean you have to get good at writing, but if you get good at writing, there's a gazillion opportunities. Okay, let's open it up for questions. Questions, anybody, or anybody might take any of your questions.